At 8:30 p.m. on August 20th, 2010, a 76-year-old man named Zhang walked through the streets of New Taipei City, which is a major city in northern Taiwan. Zhang was on the end of an evening walk, and he was making his way back towards his daughter's apartment, where he was also staying. And as Zhang neared the apartment, he happened to notice there was a street lamp right outside with this big poster attached to it that he hadn't seen before. And as he got closer, he saw there was also this picture of this middle-aged woman whose name was Chen Yan-Chui, and apparently she was missing. And not only that, she also lived in the same building that his daughter lived in. Except Chen was actually a dementia patient, and she was staying on the 5th floor of this apartment building complex where there was this memory care facility, and that's where she was being taken care of. And about a week earlier, she had gone out for an evening walk, this is what it said on the poster, and just not returned. And so since the week before, police had been out looking for her and her family and friends. They were putting these posters up, and it was clear, nobody had found her yet. Now, Zhang had never met this woman, but he sort of felt bad for her. And so he found himself staring at this picture and trying to memorize her face, in the off chance that he just saw her somewhere. He could report her to the authorities and hopefully get her rescued. And so after staring at the picture for a little bit longer and sort of feeling bad for this woman, Zhang turned and just continued inside the apartment building. And once he was in the apartment building, he made his way over to the elevator. He hit the up button and he waited, and then a moment later, there was a ding and the doors opened up. He stepped onto the elevator, he pressed the button, the doors closed, and then Zhang waited as he headed up to his daughter's apartment on the 7th floor. But as he was going up, he noticed he had accidentally hit the 6th floor, not the 7th floor. And right at that moment, he saw that he was reaching the 6th floor, and so the elevator car was slowing down. And so he just was like, oh, whoops, and he hit floor 7. But by the time he hit floor 7, the car had come to a stop on floor 6, and the doors were opening. Like it would need to reset. Doors open on 6, they close, and then he'd go to 7. Like this is no big deal. And so Zhang is just waiting, for these doors to open, shut, and go up one more floor. However, when the doors opened on floor 6, Zhang is looking straight out, and he could not believe what he saw, and he just began to scream. Around the same time this was happening, Zhang's daughter was finishing up her shift at work when she got a phone call, and she saw it was coming from her dad, and he rarely called her when she was at work. So this was sort of confusing and surprising, and so right away she picked it up and she answered, and immediately she hears her dad screaming incoherently. He's obviously terrified, and all Zhang's daughter can hear is that her dad is saying he's trapped in an elevator and he doesn't know what to do. And so, Zhang's daughter is getting scared just based on what her dad sounds like. She doesn't really know what's going on, but she told her dad, like, okay, I'll call the building. We'll get you some help. Like, stay calm. You're gonna be okay. But her dad just continued rambling and he was totally incoherent. And eventually, Zhang's daughter just said, okay, Dad, like, just hang tight. I'm gonna get you some help. And then she hung up, and then she immediately called her apartment building's administration and emergency services line and told them, hey, I think my dad is stuck on one of your elevator cars. He's really upset. Can you please help him? And after getting the emergency services to, get spun up into action to go save her dad, Zhang's daughter left work, hopped in her car, and began rushing home. It would take Zhang's daughter about 40 minutes to get back to her apartment. And by the time she got there, she fully expected her dad would be safely out of the elevator. I mean, he was obviously very upset, but she had called the building. They were on it. They were going to get him out. But when she went inside the lobby of the apartment building, she saw a crowd of police officers just standing there. She didn't see her dad anywhere. And before she could even ask any questions, she noticed one of the officers was on the phone. And clearly, just based on what was being said by this officer, he was talking to her father. Like he was talking to somebody who was hysterical, and this officer was doing his best to try to calm him down and sort of talk him through what was happening. And so Zhang's daughter immediately walks up to this officer and says, hey, I'm his daughter, the guy who's stuck in the elevator, I'm his daughter. What's going on? I would have figured he'd be out by now. Like, what's happened? At this point, one of the officers confirms that, this really is this man's daughter. And he pulls her aside and he explains to her that, yes, your dad is still in the elevator because we can't get him out. The reality is this is not a normal situation here. He's trapped in there, and really the only way for him to get out is for him to do something really specific. Like us and the building staff, we can't do anything. He has to do this one really specific thing, and right now he's refusing to do it. He's too panicked, he's too scared, we're trying to calm him down, but it's not working. And so Jong's daughter asked this officer, can you please explain to me what you're talking about? Like, what is this specific thing you want him to do? I don't get it. And at that point, the officer kind of composed himself and explained to the daughter, what was really going on inside of that elevator car. And after Jong's daughter heard it, she was horrified, and she immediately understood why her dad was so upset and unwilling to do this one particular thing that would save him, but would be pretty awful. She got it, but she knew she would have to hop on the phone and convince her dad that he had to do it, like there was no other way. And so she walked over to the officer who was on the phone with her dad. She took the phone and she began talking her dad through, what he really needed to do here. She basically gave him a pep talk and said, Dad, for me, you gotta find the strength and do this thing and get out of there. And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, the elevator doors in the lobby chimed and opened up, and Jong came stumbling out. He looked horrible, disheveled, but he was okay. And right away, police officers rushed towards him, but they bypassed him and went into the elevator and immediately surrounded something in the elevator car. It would turn out that missing woman, Chun Yan-chui, the woman who was on that poster that Jong saw before he walked into the apartment building, well, she really had gone missing a week earlier on her evening walk. But everybody thought she got lost while she was on that walk because she was a dementia patient, and so, she had memory issues. But the reality was, she actually did come back to her apartment. However, when she got on the elevator, she actually made the same mistake that Jong did. Now, she was not trying to get to the 7th floor, she was trying to get to the 5th floor, but she accidentally pressed the 6th floor. So up she goes, she gets to the 6th floor, the doors open up, she steps off the elevator car, and she's immediately completely confused. And for what it's worth, it didn't matter that she had dementia. Anybody who got off on the 6th floor would likely be confused if you had never been to this building before, because the 6th floor was actually a private residence. And the person who lived on that floor was so worried about people breaking into their private residence that they had installed a metal gate in front of the elevator doors. And so unless you had the key to get through this gate, when you got off on the 6th floor, you basically would step onto a little platform that basically is the hallway leading into the 6th floor, and then you'd be hit with the gate. And so that's exactly what happened to Chun. She got off on the 6th floor, maybe thinking this is the 5th floor. She stepped onto that, little narrow strip that you could actually stand on the 6th floor before you reached the gate. And then as she was trying to figure out, where am I? This isn't the 5th floor. This doesn't make any sense. There's a gate in front of me. The doors to the elevator closed, and she had no way to open them up again because the buttons to access the elevator were beyond the gate. And so suddenly Chun is standing in this narrow space, the doors have closed behind her, and she can't do anything. She's trapped between the gate and the elevator doors. And even though people are using this elevator right behind her, the only person who would come to the 6th floor is the owner of that residence, and they were on vacation. And so for days and days, Chun is just trapped basically in between the gate and the elevator with no one having any idea she was there. She's calling out, she's doing everything she can to get somebody's attention, but nobody can hear her. And after 5 days of this, when the owner of this residence didn't come home because they were on vacation, she eventually died because she didn't have food or water or anything. She was just standing there for 5 days. And so she dies, and then a couple of days later, Jong accidentally rides to the 6th floor. He's like, oh shoot, I need to go to 7. He hits 7, but the doors open on 6. And when they do, Chun's body, which had been basically frozen in this standing position, fell backwards onto him, pinned him to the ground. He starts screaming and freaking out. He gets out from underneath her, but her body, which was in rigor mortis at this point, is stiff, and she was lying like a board on the ground with her feet jutting out onto the 6th floor and her upper half inside of the elevator. And so she was blocking the doors from closing. And so Jong is freaking out. He's calling his daughter. He can't believe this. There's this dead person in here. And eventually police get involved and they tell Jong, you just gotta move the body so the doors will close. But again, her body is heavy and it's stiff and she's obviously deceased. She's starting to decompose, and Jong basically couldn't handle it, and he was unwilling to move her body until his daughter hopped on the phone and said, you gotta do it. At which point, He managed to lift her up, get her out of the way, and kind of push her off to the side of the elevator car. He rode down to the bottom, at which point the police came in and handled the situation. Now, the owner of the 6th floor residence was not held criminally responsible, despite putting that gate up that created this trap that killed Chun. However, despite that, he would end up paying Chun's family about $97,000 equivalent just to compensate for her death. On the morning of August 18, 2018, a 41-year-old man named Vladimir Kostenko stepped out of a taxi onto a desolate road in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, miles and miles from civilization. All he had with him were his cell phone, a solar-powered charger for his phone, and a backpack that contained some clothes and 5 pounds of oatmeal. Vladimir bent down and leaned into the taxi to pay the taxi driver, and as he was doing that, the driver looked up at him and just said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And Vladimir just smiled and nodded and said, "Yep, I'm gonna be just fine. Don't worry about me." Now, the taxi driver did not really buy this and just looked at Vladimir like he was completely insane. But Vladimir wasn't shocked. I mean, this is kind of how everybody reacted to him when he told them about this trip he was doing into the wilderness. You know, when he had brought it up to his family the first time, they and all of their family friends had basically rallied together to try to stop Vladimir from going on this trip. It was way too dangerous. But Vladimir said, "Guys, I'm going. Like, you can't stop me. I'm doing this. It's important to me." And at that point, when, the family and friends knew they couldn't change his mind, they shifted and said, "Well, at least, bring a gun or bear spray or something to protect yourself." But Vladimir also refused that too. He said, "Nope, I don't need any of that because the only thing I need is God. God is going to protect me." So Vladimir was extremely religious. He actually had left his home country, Russia, when he was in his early 20s because he was being persecuted for his Christian beliefs. And so now, in the United States, he lived out in Washington State and basically lived his life like a monk. I mean, he spent the majority of his time, basically praying and meditating and reading religious books, and he would often go on these multi-day long fasts. He did work part-time as a mechanic, but he rarely charged his clients when he did work. And then even when he did charge them, he was working so few hours that the money he was making was totally unsubstantial. But again, the way Vladimir looked at this is he didn't need money because ultimately God would take care of him. But despite all of his fasting and his praying and, his generosity, lately Vladimir had been feeling really lost. Like, he did feel deeply spiritual, but at the same time, he didn't really feel fulfilled. Like, he felt like he was missing purpose in his life, and it was really starting to bother him. And so it was around this time that Vladimir decided to go on this big trip. One of Vladimir's family friends was this guy named Dmitry Kudrin, and he owned this small cabin way out in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Now, Dmitry didn't use this cabin very much, but he kept it in great shape. It was fully furnished, there was a wood-burning stove inside, and the pantry was stocked with 3 years' supply of food. And so at some point, when Vladimir and Dmitry were talking, and Vladimir talked about feeling sort of lost and wanting to reconnect with his spirituality and find his purpose in life, well, at some point, Dmitry said, "Well, hey, if you want, you can go use my cabin and sort of disconnect from society and go retreat out there and sort of focus on yourself and sort of get right with the world. You're welcome to go out there anytime you want. You can stay out there as long as you want and for free, no problem." And Vladimir had happily accepted. And now here he was, standing on this desolate road in the Alaskan wilderness, watching as the taxi driver drove away. Except he wasn't even close to the cabin. I mean, he was in the middle of nowhere already, but he still had to go 14 more miles with no trail to make his way to this cabin. But Vladimir was so excited, he really felt like this was the thing he needed to figure out his purpose in life. And so he put his backpack on, took a deep breath, and began to hike. 3 months later, on November 3rd of 2018, Dmitry, Vladimir's friend who owned this cabin, found himself in his plane flying over the area roughly where his cabin was. And Dmitry was feeling very concerned. So obviously, Dmitry suggested Vladimir go out and use this cabin, and so he was totally open to the idea of it. But Dmitry had also told Vladimir that when he went out there, he really ought to bring a gun with him, Or if nothing else, at least some bear spray or something to protect himself, because this is truly the wild. You are not the top of the food chain anymore, and you want to be able to protect yourself. But Vladimir had said no, he would not be going with any sort of weaponry, that, God was going to look after him and he'd be fine. And Dmitri's like, that's a bad plan, but he just could not convince Vladimir to change his mind. And so ultimately, Dmitri sort of regretted even suggesting this idea because he didn't expect Vladimir to go unarmed, but he felt like, it's already in motion. And so he told Vladimir, okay, fine, do your thing, but when you're out there, I need you to communicate with me regularly so I know you're okay. And Vladimir promised he would. And at first, that is exactly what happened. Vladimir, made the 14-mile hike from where he was dropped by the taxi. He got to the cabin, he got all set up, and then just about every other day or every few days, he would hike up this nearby mountain where there was cell phone service, and he would update Dmitri. He would tell him that things were going great. He was spending lots of time meditating and praying, and he was foraging for berries, and there was this pesky squirrel that kept coming in and stealing his food, so he was trying to figure out what to do with the squirrel, but clearly things were going fine, and Vladimir appeared to be safe. However, after 6 weeks of Vladimir being at this cabin, those pretty regular updates just abruptly stopped. Now, at first, Dmitri kind of chalked it up as like, well, I've been talking to him for weeks. There didn't appear to be any, burgeoning crises or anything going on in his life that might warrant some concern. He's a capable guy, maybe because it's the Alaskan winter and Alaskan winters are notoriously dark. There's not a lot of sunlight. Maybe his solar-powered charger isn't working. He can't get enough sunlight, so he can't charge his phone. And so maybe that's what it is. He just can't contact me because his phone doesn't turn on. Basically, Dmitri was coming up with these sort of rationales for why he wasn't hearing from his friend. But as the days went on and Dmitri still didn't hear from Vladimir, he couldn't help but start to feel like something's wrong here. And so finally, in early November, when Dmitri still had not heard from Vladimir, it's been about a month since those text messages stopped, Dmitri decided to get into his plane and fly out over the area where this cabin was and literally look down and see if his friend was down there in the cabin. Also, this gave Dmitri the opportunity to put some supplies on the plane in these big buckets that he could literally throw out down to Vladimir to also restock him. So Dmitri is now in his plane and he's circling around the area where his cabin is. But this cabin is really small and it's sort of in this big sea of trees. I mean, there's nothing else for miles. And so it's pretty difficult with the naked eye to actually look out and see his own cabin. But Dmitri had this camera on the underside of his plane that he could maneuver and look all around. And he had this screen that he could see from the cockpit that was basically an enhanced view of the ground down below. It was a lot easier to see, for example, his cabin. And so as he was circling, he's moving the camera around, and then bam, he sees right in the middle of his screen is his cabin. And there doesn't appear to be anything wrong with the cabin. It all looks good. There's smoke coming up out of the chimney. And as he's circling, he's thinking, okay, Vladimir clearly is going to hear me. He's going to come outside and I'll see that he's okay. And sure enough, as he's circling around, Dmitri sees on his screen that the front door of the cabin opens and his friend Vladimir walks right outside onto the porch. He puts his hands on his hips and he looks up and he waves at Dmitri. And there's this moment of clear recognition, like obviously Vladimir knows this is Dmitri coming to check on him, and Vladimir's down there kind of gesticulating that, hey, everything's fine, I'm good, sorry about the phone thing, or, Dmitri didn't know what he was doing, but it just sort of seemed like, okay, there's recognition here, that it's been a month, but everything is fine. And so Dmitri got down nice and low and continued to circle, and on one of his passes over the cabin, he pulled a lever, dropped the supplies, those buckets of supplies, they landed down below, and then as Dmitri continued to circle, he watched on the camera as Vladimir walked up and put his hands on the supplies and waved again to Dmitri, sort of signaling, thank you for the supplies. And at that point, Dmitri's thinking, okay, Vladimir's just fine. Everything's good. I can go home. And so that's what he did. Now, he would have landed and gone and seen Vladimir up close, but there wasn't anywhere to land anywhere nearby. Like this was the closest he could get to Vladimir. And so he decided this was enough. So Dmitri, he turned around and he headed home. But about 2 months later, on December 23rd, Dmitri was once again in his plane flying over the area where his cabin was. Because over these last 2 months, he continued not to get any text messages or any communication from Vladimir, which, that was bad. He sort of expected that, given that Dmitri flew out there before and they clearly recognized, like, hey, are you good? There was sort of a moment of recognition that Dmitri's checking in on Vladimir because of the silence. That's what Dmitri's thinking. Maybe that would inspire Vladimir to find a way to send out communications now, like let Dmitri know he's okay. But he hadn't for 2 months. And so Dmitri's thinking, okay, that's bad. Also, it's now December. And the winter in Alaska is full bore. I mean, tons of snow on the ground. It's frigid temperatures. It is truly brutal winter conditions. And then lastly, there had also just been this major earthquake in the area where Dmitri's cabin was. And so all those things combined made Dmitri think, okay, I better get out there and just check on Vladimir again. And so once again, Dmitri is circling low over the area where his cabin is. He's got his camera trained towards the ground and he's moving it around as he's circling, and eventually, he finds his cabin, and his cabin is clearly in one piece, so the earthquake did not destroy his cabin, but there's no sign of Vladimir anywhere. But then again, this is just the first second he's seen the cabin. He's only been in the area for a couple of minutes now. Maybe Vladimir has not heard the plane yet, and so, Dmitri's not lost hope, and he continues to circle. And as he's circling, he drops these supply buckets that land right out in front of the cabin. And at this point, Dmitri's thinking, okay, that's pretty noisy, having these supply buckets smash into the ground outside. Certainly now Vladimir is going to come outside to see what's going on. I mean, there's not much else happening. This clearly is something that would draw his attention, but no, nobody comes out of the cabin. And so at this point, Dmitri gets as low as he possibly can, and he's got his camera trained right at the cabin, and as he's doing another pass, he realizes something. There's no smoke coming out of the chimney. In fact, the top of the chimney is covered with snow, which means clearly no fire has been lit, at least not recently. And so Dmitri starts to panic. Like, if anybody was in that cabin right now without a fire lit, it would be so cold, they would likely freeze to death really quickly. Like, this is a crisis. What's going on with Vladimir? But Dmitri couldn't land anywhere nearby. Like, there was no way for him to really get down to this cabin. So he had to fly all the way to the nearest airport, and then once he touched down, he immediately contacted Alaska State Troopers to report his friend missing, because that was the only thing he could think to do. However, after Dmitri made this report, the state troopers didn't launch some huge search for Vladimir. And that's in part because they weren't actually sure he was missing. They understood that Dmitri, after flying out over the area, had seen snow on the chimney cap, and, it's really cold out, like nobody could survive without a fire. And also, he flew over the area, dropped supplies, and Vladimir didn't come out of the cabin. How could he not hear that stuff? They understood that. But they're also thinking, it's possible Vladimir just might not have been in the area. Maybe he was out hunting or, foraging for food or whatever he was doing, and maybe he just wasn't in the area. And that's why it gave you the impression that he was missing. And so that was one part of it. And the other part is the weather was atrocious in this part of the world. And so just sending out a search party into the terrible weather out into the wilderness was really risky. And so the troopers thought it just wasn't worth doing this big search. And so instead of launching a big search, the troopers told Dmitri that what they were going to do instead is just comb through airline records, local airline records, to see if maybe a Vladimir Kostenko had, taken off and flown out of the area. Maybe he didn't tell Dmitri and he just left. Maybe that's why he's not there. And this really frustrated Dmitri and the rest of Vladimir's family, because they're all looking at this as a true emergency. And they're thinking, there's no way he just hopped on a plane and flew out of here without telling anyone. And so finally, 3 days after filing this missing person report, Dmitri said, enough is enough. I'm gonna just take it into my own hands and go out there myself and see what's going on with Vladimir. So he chartered a private helicopter and he flew out to the cabin. And when he got there, he gets off the helicopter and he just scans the property. And he sees, this little cabin, and there's, firewood outside stacked up with snow all over it. There's loads of snow in the cabin, and there's snow kind of drifted up on the front door, making it seem like nobody's come in or out of this cabin for some time. And, Dmitri, he's looking around for Vladimir, but there's no sign of life anywhere. Dmitri calls out for Vladimir, but there's no response. And so, with some level of trepidation, Dmitri begins walking up towards his cabin. And when he gets close enough to the front door, he notices something weird. He sees that the front door of this cabin has clearly been boarded up from the outside. There's this big piece of metal that's been placed basically blocking the door so nobody could go inside of it. And so Dimitri's thinking, like, why would you do this unless you were leaving the cabin? But why would Vladimir leave the cabin? Like, where is he? I don't understand what's going on here. And so Dimitri goes up to this piece of metal and pries it off the front door. And then he swings open the front door and he looks inside, and everything is pristine. Vladimir is not inside, but the cabin looks immaculate. There's still firewood, there's still food, there's no sign of chaos, no sign of any struggle whatsoever, like everything looks exactly like it should. And so Dimitri, he began walking around inside of this cabin, looking for any clue as to what happened to Vladimir. But there was nothing. Until he got to the firewood. He noticed that clearly Vladimir had been labeling his firewood. There was one piece of firewood in particular where the writing was very clear, and what it said was, "Frankincense aroma, do not burn." And so Dimitri's looking at this piece of wood, that's been labeled as something that he shouldn't be burning, and he's looking at other pieces of wood that also have some level of labeling on them, and he's thinking, like, what does that mean? I don't understand that at all. But that was it. There was no other clues about where Vladimir had gone. And even the labeling of the wood, like, that didn't give him anything. And so the impression that Dimitri got after seeing this firsthand was that at some point, Vladimir, for reasons completely unknown, just decided to board up the cabin and disappear into the Alaskan wilderness with basically no protection, no clear sign he even brought food with him. He just got up and left. Friends and family, and even some authorities, believe there is a chance he could still be out there somewhere. In fact, at one point, authorities thought they had found Vladimir in Hawaii. It turned out not to be him. And then again, they thought they found him in Oregon. It turned out not to be him as well. But the case is still open, and authorities think, at least some do, that he might be alive somewhere. But nobody knows where. And so at this point, all the family has to go off of is the final image of Vladimir, which was taken from inside of Dimitri's plane when he did that first flyover, and he saw Vladimir come out on the porch. That is the final image of Vladimir that we know of. We don't know what happened after this image. All we know is, at some point he began labeling his firewood, writing down which aroma the wood makes, and then he boarded his place up and he left. But where he went next is still a mystery. On the afternoon of Sunday, April 23rd, 2017, 20-year-old Haley Rathgaber walked across the busy dining room of the Texas Roadhouse restaurant in Evansville, Indiana, carrying 2 plates of hot food from the kitchen. Haley stopped at a table near a window and set the plates down in front of a pair of customers. Then she gave a big smile and told them to enjoy the meal. But as Haley walked back towards the kitchen, she happened to glance up at the clock on the wall, and when she saw the time, her smile totally disappeared and she felt this jolt of anxiety. Haley knew in a little under an hour, her shift would be over, and she would no longer have work to take her mind off this insane secret that she was keeping from almost everybody she knew. Earlier that month, one of Haley's best friends, a young woman named Jordan Hughes, had lost her 10-month-old baby in a devastating accident. Jordan's boyfriend, who was not the baby's father but was helping take care of him, had been home alone with the baby. He'd strapped the baby into a car seat and started walking down the stairs in the house when he suddenly tripped over a diaper bag, and he and the baby both went tumbling down the steps, which ultimately resulted in the child's death. Or at least, that's what he had told his girlfriend Jordan and the police. Jordan had gotten the news quickly about her child and rushed to the hospital, hoping her baby would survive. And she told Haley everything that had happened and asked Haley to go to her house to pick up some things for her and bring them back to the hospital. But when Haley got to Jordan's house, she quickly realized that the story Jordan's boyfriend had told them didn't make any sense. The diaper bag that the boyfriend had supposedly tripped over was neatly placed on the couch, and it looked like it had never even been used, let alone tripped over in this dramatic fashion that the boyfriend had described. Haley had also noticed there was no scuff marks on the stairs or the nearby wall. Nothing anywhere inside the house appeared to be damaged or in disorder, and practically everything she saw seemed to contradict the boyfriend's story. And so by the time Haley had left Jordan's house, she was convinced that Jordan's boyfriend, a guy named Thaddeus Rice, was lying. And when the baby had eventually died at the hospital, Haley felt almost positive that Thaddeus had something to do with the baby's death. Back in the busy restaurant, Haley grabbed more food from the kitchen and delivered it to one of her tables. For some reason, whenever she was helping customers or talking to her close friends she worked with, a small group that called themselves the Roadies, she could totally block out everything she'd seen in Jordan's house. The second she closed out her final table, Haley felt like she might have a panic attack right there in the middle of the restaurant. Haley took a seat at the restaurant bar and tried to catch her breath. She removed her work apron and then reached inside the front pouch of the apron and pulled out a thick wad of cash, her tip money for the night. She slipped the cash into her jeans pocket and just kept taking deep breaths, trying as hard as she could to calm herself down. Haley suddenly felt a hand on her back, and she turned and saw her friend and coworker, Ainsley Bowles, take the seat next to her. Haley had only shared the secret with two people, her mother and Ainsley. And while Haley's mother had told her to go talk to the police immediately about Thaddeus, Ainsley understood why Haley still had not done that, because Ainsley and Haley were both afraid of Thaddeus. He was their friend's boyfriend, so they'd always tried to get along with him, but they knew Thaddeus had a criminal record and had been involved in at least one rape case. Ainsley asked Haley how she was holding up, but before Haley could answer, another member of the roadie crew, Jake Allen, walked up to the bar and announced that he was hosting a small hangout after he got off work, and if anybody wanted to come over and have drinks, they were welcome. He said so far, their friend and fellow roadie, Isaiah, would be there, but he was hoping more people would come. Haley thought about it for a second. Now, she loved hanging out with Jake and Isaiah and the rest of the roadie's crew, and specifically with Jake and Isaiah, she would typically confide in both of them about everything, like she did with Ainsley. But right now, she just didn't want to tell these guys what was going on with her, because Jake and Isaiah could be very protective of Haley and Ainsley, and she didn't want them doing anything stupid or drastic once they learned about her theory around Thaddeus and the baby. Also, Haley and Ainsley had a big exam in one of their college classes the following morning. And so ultimately, Haley and Ainsley thanked Jake for the offer, but said they would both have to pass this time. Jake said he totally understood, but if either of them changed their minds, they knew how to reach him. Jake returned to work, and Haley and Ainsley stayed at the bar. And at some point, in a voice barely above a whisper, Ainsley asked Haley if she was going to finally tell Thaddeus' girlfriend, or the cops, about her suspicions. Haley looked down and said she still had no clue. Every time she thought about it, she got so scared about what Thaddeus might do to her. Later that evening, Haley was at her apartment alone, studying for her big exam and still trying to keep her mind off of everything else, when she heard her phone vibrate on the table. She put down her notes, looked at her phone, and saw a text message. After reading it, Haley thought about it for a second. She knew she really should keep on studying, but this diversion might help her relax for a bit. So she picked up her phone and replied to the message, and then afterward, she headed to the bathroom to put on some makeup and also change out of her t-shirt and sweats and put on a pair of jeans, a long-sleeve shirt, and a jacket. She was ready to go out. The next morning, so April 24th, a woman was driving her daughter to school along the route she always took. She knew this route so well, in fact, that sometimes she found herself zoning out completely while driving it, almost like she was on autopilot. But on this morning, as she approached the soccer field that stood out from the endless grassy overgrowth that surrounded the area, something caught this woman's attention. At first, she couldn't make out what she was seeing. All she could tell was that there was something strange in the soccer field's gravel parking lot. And then, as she continued down the road and got a little bit closer and realized what she was seeing, the woman slammed on the brakes and told her daughter to wait in the car. The woman got out of her car and ran over to the soccer parking lot, hoping maybe her eyes had just played a trick on her and she hadn't really seen what she thought she saw. But when she got closer, she knew she had been right. She grabbed her phone and called 911. About 15 minutes later, so just after 7 a.m., Warwick County Sheriff's investigator, Paul Cruz, pulled up to the soccer field, got out of his unmarked police car, and made his way past the yellow crime scene tape. Cruz greeted the deputies and members of the forensics team who had arrived shortly before him. Then he walked past them and continued a bit further across the lot, and there he saw a young woman lying dead in the gravel. Cruz knelt down next to her and saw a wound in the back of her head, which clearly looked like it came from a gunshot, and he also saw a blue towel that was covered in blood lying next to her. Cruz scanned the ground near the body, and he didn't see any drag marks or anything to indicate that this young woman had been taken to this location by force. He and the forensics team would obviously need to do a lot more work, but for now, Cruz figured the most logical explanation was that this young woman had been walking through the lot when someone approached her from behind and shot her. Cruz looked around the lot and got an eerie feeling. He didn't see a single streetlight or lamppost anywhere in sight. This area was totally desolate, so if this young woman had been killed last night or early in the morning, it would have been pitch black here. Cruz had no idea why this young woman was walking through this dark parking lot, but he did know it would have been really easy for someone to follow her without ever being seen. Cruz crouched down over the body again, and he noticed an area of bare gravel on both sides of one of the dead woman's legs. It almost looked like she had made a partial snow angel in the gravel with that leg, and this really upset Cruz, because it likely meant that this young woman had not died immediately after being shot. She had fallen to the ground and squirmed before dying. Cruz stood back up and stepped away from the body, and then asked a crime scene investigator if he or anyone else had found a wallet or any kind of ID at the scene. But the crime scene investigator just shook his head. The dead woman had nothing on her. No wallet, no cell phone, no keys, nothing. They had no idea who this victim was. Later that morning, about 15 miles away from that soccer field, Haley's mother, Heather Collins, poured herself a mug of coffee, sat down on her front porch, and opened up her laptop. Heather began by scrolling through Facebook, which she did every morning. But, as she read through the posts in her feed, she began seeing something that disturbed her. All her friends from town were posting the same story from the local news. It was about this unidentified young woman who was found dead that morning outside of town. Heather's kids were 3 young women, all close in age, and so Heather immediately felt the maternal instinct to check on them and make sure each of them was okay. And so she promptly sent text messages to her 2 youngest daughters and then also to Haley, her oldest daughter. And within minutes, her phone lit up, and Heather was relieved to see responses from her 2 younger girls. But she didn't get a response from Haley. However, she wasn't surprised, because she knew Haley had an important exam that morning, and Haley usually prioritized school over anything else. But an hour went by, and Heather still had not heard from Haley, so she called Haley's phone. The call went straight to voicemail. Heather left her daughter a message, trying to disguise how worried she was starting to feel. The next 30 minutes slowed to a crawl, as Haley still didn't get in touch with her mother. And so finally, Heather picked up her phone again, and she called Haley's friend, Ainsley, who went to the same college as Haley. Ainsley answered, and before Heather could even explain why she was calling, Ainsley asked her what was going on. She said Haley had not shown up to class that morning and missed the big exam. When Haley's mother heard this, she immediately felt sick to her stomach and had this horrible sense of dread come over her. Heather hung up and began talking aloud, trying to soothe herself. This was not her child out by the soccer field. It couldn't be her. It can't be her. Heather kept repeating this over and over again like a mantra, trying to convince herself that Haley was really safe, but it didn't work. So, after desperately waiting to hear back from Haley for a bit longer and still not hearing from her, Heather grabbed her phone once more and called a friend of hers who happened to be a detective for the Evansville Police Department. And when the detective answered, Heather told him that she had heard the news about the unidentified body and she couldn't get in touch with her daughter Haley, and she was now really worried. Heather's detective friend told her that given where the body was found, that this case was actually out of his jurisdiction. However, he did have some contacts at the Warwick County Sheriff's Office, and he said he would call them to see what he could find out. Heather provided her detective friend a physical description of Haley. She had long light brown hair with blonde highlights, and her teeth were always really bright white. Heather also told the detective the type of clothing Haley typically wore, and she sent him pictures of Haley's tattoos. Then she hung up and waited. A short time later, Heather's phone rang. It was now the Warwick County Sheriff's Office calling, and when they spoke to her, they said they actually wanted to speak to her in person. Haley's mother immediately began to shake, and she felt the blood drain from her face. She could think of only one reason why they would want to talk to her face to face, and she just wanted to curl up and die. Anything but face the news she knew she was about to hear. A short time later, Heather heard a knock on her door. When she opened it up, she saw it was deputies from the Warwick County Sheriff's Office. Heather immediately began to shake all over, and she felt the blood drain from her face. And as soon as she heard one of the deputies utter the words, "I'm sorry," Heather broke down and collapsed to the floor. Her daughter Haley was dead. Later that afternoon, investigator Cruz walked away from the crime scene at the soccer field, got into his car, and began driving across town. And as he drove, he felt very frustrated. Earlier, he'd gotten a call from the station, so he now knew his victim was a college student named Haley Rathgaber. But that was about all he knew. He and his team had thoroughly combed the crime scene and the area surrounding it, but almost nothing had come from their search. Not even a single shell casing had turned up. In fact, the only evidence that had been bagged at the scene was that bloody blue towel found next to the body, which the medical examiner was sending off to the crime lab for DNA analysis. After a short drive, investigator Cruz pulled into the sheriff's station, and he walked in just as Heather, Haley's mom, was arriving. She was there to get more information about what happened to her daughter. Cruz very gently approached Heather, who was clearly still crying, and he told her how sorry he was that her daughter was gone, and he promised that he'd find out who did this and bring that person to justice. Cruz understood now was not a great time to sit down and ask Heather a bunch of questions, but he said he did need to ask her one thing. Could she think of anyone at all, who might have wanted to hurt Haley? Haley's mother didn't even hesitate. She looked right at Cruz and said she knew of one person for sure who would want to do this: Thaddeus Rice. When Cruz heard this name, he did a double take. Cruz knew this name very well, because Thaddeus Rice was a suspect in another case he was currently working on. So now Cruz really wanted to know more if Heather was comfortable still sharing. Heather said, of course, and she proceeded to tell him the whole story. And as Cruz listened to Heather, he knew exactly where the story was going, because this story was the other case he was investigating: the death of Thaddeus's girlfriend's baby boy. Heather told Cruz that Haley suspected Thaddeus might have been directly involved in the death of that baby. And so Heather said if Thaddeus knew Haley suspected him, he would have every reason to want to shut her up. Before Cruz could even respond, Heather took her phone out of her pocket and told him she needed to show him something. She unlocked her phone and quickly pulled up a message that a friend of Haley's had sent her just before Cruz had arrived at the station. It was a video that Thaddeus had recently posted to his social media. And in this video, Thaddeus is seen posing with a gun. Immediately after seeing this video, Cruz thanked Heather for the information, and he turned around, got back into his car, and drove to Thaddeus's workplace. And when he got there, Thaddeus happened to be outside on a break. However, the second Cruz stepped out of his car, Thaddeus waved him away dismissively and said he had nothing to say to him. Cruz made it clear to Thaddeus that he was not there to talk about the dead baby. Instead, he was there to talk about Haley. Thaddeus just stared back at Cruz, and Cruz honestly couldn't tell if Thaddeus was confused or scared. Finally, though, Thaddeus said he wouldn't talk to cops without an attorney, and then he turned and walked away. Cruz knew he could go after Thaddeus, but he also knew it wouldn't make a difference. Thaddeus was not about to talk to him. Thaddeus had been involved in enough criminal cases to understand his rights. But even without having a long conversation with him, Thaddeus's reaction to hearing Haley's name had just made him seem a whole lot more suspicious. Around the same time Cruz was confronting Thaddeus, a young man named Isaiah Hagen sat on his front porch staring at his phone. Isaiah was Haley's close friend and coworker, one of the members of the Roadies crew, and right now he was looking at a series of text messages from other members of that group, specifically his friends Jake and Ainsley, saying that Haley had been found dead by the soccer field just outside of town. And so Isaiah was just processing it and beginning to cry, and then right at that moment, he heard his mother inside the house behind him, and he instinctively just got up, went inside, and hugged his mom, and began crying even harder. She asked him what was wrong, and Isaiah told her about Haley, and his mom couldn't believe what she was hearing. She worked for the county sheriff, so she knew all about the young woman who'd been found at the soccer field, but she had no idea this young woman was one of her son's good friends. Isaiah hugged his mother tighter and told her that none of this made any sense, because he'd just seen Haley the night before and everything had seemed fine. How could she be dead? Isaiah's mom pulled away from him, and she told him she understood how upset he was, but he really needed to go talk to the lead investigator right away, because even if Isaiah didn't realize it, he might have seen something or heard Haley say something last night that could help investigators find her killer. Cruz was at the station sitting at his desk looking through Thaddeus's rap sheet when his phone rang. He picked up the call, and Isaiah introduced himself and said that his mother worked at the sheriff's station. Cruz asked if everything was okay, and Isaiah said he was calling about his friend Haley, the girl who'd been found at the soccer field. He explained to Cruz that he had just seen Haley the night before, and he wanted to help if he could. Cruz told Isaiah that he could help by walking him through everything he remembered from the previous night. This would help Cruz flesh out the timeline of Haley's final hours. Isaiah told Cruz that the night before, he had been at his friend Jake Allen's place playing video games when he got a text message from Haley. And in this text, she said she was going to meet someone at a local park where the college students sometimes hang out. And she asked Isaiah if he could give her a ride because she didn't want to leave her car there. Isaiah said that was no problem, so he had left Jake's place, went to Haley's, hung out with her for a minute, and then drove her to the park. Isaiah told Cruz he had no idea who she was meeting. He said he didn't ask her about it because it felt like it was none of his business, especially if she was meeting up with some guy who she was romantically involved with. Isaiah said after he dropped Haley off, he just went back to Jake's house and kept playing video games until very early in the morning. Inspector Cruz kept listening and writing everything down, but then suddenly Isaiah just went silent, and Cruz could hear him trying to catch his breath. And when Isaiah started talking again, it was clear he was very upset. He told Cruz he felt really guilty now, and he wished he had asked Haley who she was meeting, because maybe he could have done something to protect her, or at a minimum today been able to provide the police a suspect. Cruz told Isaiah that he appreciated him calling in, and that he would follow up if he had any questions. After getting off the phone with Isaiah, Cruz quickly scanned the list of coworkers that Haley worked with at the Texas Roadhouse, and just as he remembered, there was Jake Allen's name and a phone number right next to it. And so Cruz called Jake and asked him if he could verify the times he had hung out with Isaiah the night before, and Jake corroborated Isaiah's story. But while speaking to Jake, investigator Cruz looked up Jake's address, and he saw that Jake lived very close to the park where Isaiah said he'd dropped Haley off, and that park was only a few miles from the soccer field where Haley was found dead. And so Cruz began to question Jake about his own activities the previous night, and pretty quickly, the call took a very weird turn. Now, Cruz considered all of Haley's friends and coworkers to be possible suspects, but he really thought this call might just be a chance to cross Jake off his list. But Cruz noticed that Jake suddenly started to sound very nervous and defensive as soon as his actions were called into question. Jake insisted that he hadn't seen Haley at all the previous night. In fact, he hadn't seen Haley since work that afternoon. He said he had invited her and their other friend Ainsley over to hang out, but they both had declined. And then after talking about Haley for a minute, Jake suddenly shifted gears back to Isaiah, saying he thought it was very strange how Isaiah would just drive Haley out to the park and leave her there. Cruz let Jake keep talking, but he wondered if Jake had something to hide, and if that's why he was throwing suspicion onto his friend Isaiah. After hanging up with Jake, Cruz went back to his list of everyone who had worked at the Roadhouse with Haley. Up until this call, Cruz had really only been focused on Thaddeus, who didn't work at the Roadhouse, and he definitely still considered Thaddeus a major suspect with a very clear motive. But now, Cruz felt like he really should put some additional attention on the Roadhouse employees, specifically Jake and Isaiah. On the evening of April 26th, so 2 days after Haley's body had been found, Cruz and a couple of members from his team arrived at Jake's apartment. Cruz knocked on the door, and Jake's roommate answered. Cruz introduced himself and asked to speak to Jake. The young man turned and shouted for Jake, looking a little freaked out that a bunch of cops had just shown up at his door, and then the roommate walked away. A few seconds later, Jake approached the door, wearing a dress shirt with an untied tie hanging on the collar. Cruz said he was the detective who had talked to Jake on the phone, and he needed to ask him a few more questions. Jake said he understood, but he was getting ready to leave for a candlelight vigil some friends and family were having for Haley. This made Cruz pause for a second. His investigation wasn't even 2 days old, and he'd been going pretty much non-stop since it started, and he'd almost overlooked how young Haley was and how many people her death must have affected. Still, Cruz needed some answers. He told Jake he would do his best not to keep him too long, but he needed Jake to go through everything he had done after he'd seen Haley at work on the day she died. And just like Jake had said to Cruz on the phone, he said after work he had gone home and met up with Isaiah to play video games. It was basically the same story. However, during this in-person exchange, Jake also said something about Isaiah that really stood out to Cruz and made him look at the case very differently. Cruz took notes on everything Jake told him, asked a few follow-up questions, and then he and his team left so Jake could get ready for the vigil. That night, a huge group of Haley's friends and family gathered by the soccer field where Haley had been found. The candles they lit cast a glow over the otherwise pitch-black parking lot. They laid down flowers, shared some of their favorite memories, and just talked about how much Haley had meant to all of them. Her closest friends from work left Haley's name tag and her Roadhouse cap and sweatshirt right next to a big handmade sign that simply said, "We love and miss you. Love, your roadies." On April 27th, the day after the vigil, Inspector Cruz received word from the crime lab that the results had come in on the bloody blue towel that had been found next to Haley's body. Only one DNA profile was found on the towel, and much to Cruz's disappointment, it was Haley's. Cruz had hoped he would catch a break and that these results would lead him right to the killer. But now that he knew that was not going to happen, he methodically went through his list of Haley's friends and coworkers another time. Thaddeus, who remained one of Cruz's primary suspects, still refused to say anything without a lawyer. But almost everyone else who had known Haley was willing to help and tell Cruz whatever they could. And the more Cruz spoke to Haley's friends, the more convinced he became that he was much closer to solving this case than he had initially thought. Because a lot of Haley's friends said things that pointed him in the same direction. So Cruz came up with an idea of how he might be able to track Haley's movements before she got to the soccer field where she was ultimately found. He got in his car, headed to Haley's neighborhood, and just started knocking on the door of every house or apartment complex he saw that had a security camera or a doorbell with a video camera. He asked anyone who answered if he could have the footage from their cameras to help him solve a crime. And everyone he spoke to said he absolutely could. And so after Cruz collected all of that footage from Haley's neighborhood, he did the same exact thing in Thaddeus's girlfriend's neighborhood, which is where Thaddeus spent most of his time. Over the next couple of days, Cruz sat at the station and sifted through hours upon hours of security footage that he had collected. The experience began to remind Cruz of the old cliche about watching paint dry, and at times, Cruz felt he'd much rather be looking at a freshly painted wall than at endless grainy footage of houses and apartment buildings in suburban Indiana. Cruz kept fighting off sleep and tried to keep his eyes glued on the footage as hours passed by without anything eventful happening, until he hit pay dirt. For a second, Cruz wasn't even really sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. After all, watching this footage for so long had basically sent him into a daze. So he rewound the footage and watched it again, and this time he was sure he did see something that would help him close the case and bring Haley's murderer to justice. Cruz watched more footage to make sure he wasn't missing something. He also worked with his team to collect cell phone data, and he carried out a few more interviews just to be certain he was on the right track. And on April 29th, just 5 days after Haley's body was found, Inspector Cruz knew he had found Haley's killer. He arrested them, and after that, he discovered exactly what had happened to Haley on the night she died. Based on surveillance footage, interviews, and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Haley Rathgaber on the night of April 23, 2017. Around 10:30 p.m. that night, the killer fished a 9mm handgun out of the closet and then left to go meet up with Haley. Haley got into the killer's car, and the killer began driving her to the soccer field just outside of town. When they got there, Haley and the killer stepped out of the car and began walking across the gravel parking lot near the field, with only the headlights of the killer's car and the flashlight on Haley's phone to light the way. As they walked, the killer let Haley walk ahead of them, and without Haley noticing, the killer silently drew their 9mm handgun, raised it up, aimed, and fired a single shot into the back of Haley's head. Haley stumbled, and the killer took several steps back and watched as she fell. Haley collapsed onto her back. The only part of her body that was working now was her left leg, which she jerked back and forth in the gravel as her brain slowly shut down. The killer just stood there and watched as Haley died. And in that moment, for a second, the killer felt bad about what they had just done. But regardless, after she was dead, the killer turned away from the body, went back to their car, and grabbed a blue towel they happened to have in the back seat. The killer then walked back to Haley's body, knelt down, and used the towel to wipe up some of the blood. After that, they put the towel down and then scooped up Haley's phone off the ground. They also reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, which contained $200 in cash. And then the killer stood up, took one more look at the body, and then turned and ran back to the car, carrying their gun and Haley's stuff with them. Later that night, the killer went to their friend's place and hung out playing video games all night, without ever showing the slightest hint of what they had just done. Haley's close friend and fellow roadie, Isaiah Hagen, was her killer. Isaiah, whose mother worked for the sheriff's department, had called Inspector Cruz and tried to make it look like he was helping the investigation. And Isaiah's call even threw some suspicion on his friend Jake for a time. However, when Cruz and his team met with Jake on the night of the candlelight vigil, Jake started talking about his friend Isaiah. He hated to admit it because the two young men had been really close for years, but Jake said Isaiah had been acting really strange lately, and this was because Isaiah had run into some serious money problems. It turned out that leading up to the murder, Isaiah had borrowed hundreds of dollars from his father and from Haley. While Haley had not confronted Isaiah about the money he owed her, Isaiah's father wanted to get paid back. So Isaiah decided to take the money he owed his dad from Haley. On the night of the murder, Isaiah was the one who texted Haley while she was studying and asked her if they could hang out, because he really wanted to talk to her. And Haley decided she needed a break from studying and from everything else that was going on in her life, so she said yes. Isaiah picked Haley up, but he never drove her to the park to meet someone else like he had told police. Instead, he drove right to the soccer field, and shortly after getting out of the car, he shot and killed her. It's not clear if Isaiah first tried to just ask Haley for the money and, maybe she refused to give him money and that's what led to the murder, or if Isaiah simply picked Haley up with every intention of murdering her for the money. Either way, it resulted in Haley's death and Isaiah stealing the $200 out of her wallet. In the morning following the murder, right before sunrise, Isaiah drove around town, getting rid of his gun and Haley's belongings, and then he went back to his house and left the $200 from her wallet on the kitchen counter for his dad. After speaking to Jake in person, Cruz really began to suspect that Isaiah was the killer. But he still could not just write off Thaddeus, a man who had a criminal history, had potentially harmed or even killed a baby, and who Haley had been afraid of before she died. So Cruz collected cell phone data for Haley and also for both Isaiah and Thaddeus, and he also studied all the surveillance footage he had collected. Isaiah and Haley's cell phone data showed that they had at least been near the same locations, including the soccer field, at the same time on the night of the murder. And the surveillance footage showed Isaiah pulling up to Haley's place not too long before she was killed. The footage also showed that Thaddeus had been at his girlfriend's house at the time of the murder and throughout the entire night. And so even though the murder weapon was not recovered, Cruz felt confident he'd cracked the case and he arrested Isaiah. Isaiah insisted he would never hurt Haley and that he was innocent, but during his trial, his mother was put on the witness stand and she testified that Isaiah had privately admitted to her that he'd been the one who shot Haley. He had told his mother it was an accident, but the evidence in the case did not support that. It took the jury only 4 hours to find Isaiah guilty. In early August of 2018, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Thaddeus, who Haley believed had played a part in the death of his girlfriend's baby, was eventually found guilty of neglect of a dependent and reckless homicide in the death of the child. On a sunny spring morning in 2021, 16-year-old Sabrina Blessing jolted awake inside of her Boston home with a twisting pain in her stomach. It felt as if her whole belly was being squeezed and wrung out like a wet towel. And pretty soon, the pain gave way to nausea, and Sabrina jumped for the trash can near her bedside. She vomited just as another searing pain wrenched her insides. Sabrina had been dealing with these stomach pains for the last 2 weeks. They would come on sharp and sudden, and then vanish in a matter of minutes. The first time she felt it, she thought it might be food poisoning. But the pain kept coming back day after day, getting worse each time and also lasting longer each time. This morning was the worst one yet. She had begun telling herself that, maybe she had the flu. But now, she wasn't so sure. When the vomiting finally subsided, Sabrina put the trash can back on the floor and flopped back onto her bed. She closed her eyes, feeling absolutely miserable. Her sinuses were full of snot and bile, and her forehead was damp with sweat, and she knew she looked as ragged as she felt. This was a disaster. Sabrina didn't know how she'd make it to school today, and she was terrified about what would happen if she didn't go. She'd just begun dating a new guy, and he was a star player on the football team, and every girl at school had a crush on him. And so Sabrina's mind raced with visions of him being surrounded by a bunch of cheerleaders, all trying to get his attention. The thought of that made her stomach clench all over again, but Sabrina fought through it and actually struggled out of her bed. Somehow, she made it to the bathroom, and there she began to brush her hair and to get ready for the day. However, just a minute later, the nausea once again overwhelmed her. Sabrina dropped her hairbrush and dashed to the toilet. There, she hunched over in pain, her stomach tightening up like a fist. A moment later, her mom knocked on the door and peeked inside. Sabrina sort of moaned, but told her mom she was okay. She said she was going to tough it out and go to school. Then she shakily got to her feet, but the second she stood up, she felt so lightheaded she began to fall over. Her mom rushed inside and caught her daughter just in time. She told Sabrina that school would have to wait. This had gone on long enough. She was taking Sabrina to the emergency room. When Sabrina arrived at the ER, a doctor examined her, took some blood, and then asked for a urine sample so they could run some tests. And thankfully, it all came back normal. So Sabrina asked him if she could go to school now. But the doctor shook his head, no. He said he wanted to do an ultrasound of Sabrina's abdomen, just to be sure nothing was wrong with any of her internal organs. Sabrina sighed and laid back in her hospital bed. Then she began to twirl her hair around her finger while she waited for a technician to come into her cubby in the ER with an ultrasound machine. And as she laid there, all she could think about were all the things that could go wrong with her new relationship if she didn't get to school. What if another girl did catch her boyfriend's attention? And what if she was actually sick here? Would he still want to be with her? And then Sabrina started thinking, well, wait, what if she was really sick? She had tried hard to kind of deny it, the idea that something could really be wrong with her beyond just an ordinary stomach flu. But now as she sat here, she started thinking, how bad was this really? Could her life be in danger? Suddenly, Sabrina's heart was racing with anxiety. She twirled her hair around her finger faster and faster until it was in a big giant tangle around her hand. Her mind was going a mile a minute. But if there was any relief, it was that Sabrina did not have to wait very long for her ultrasound. Just a few minutes later, the tech came in, squeezed some cold gel in her stomach, and began the ultrasound. Sabrina was glad for the distraction as the tech moved the wand across her belly, the screen flickering with shifting shapes. A minute later, the tech called the doctor in, and he glanced at the ultrasound screen. He told Sabrina that everything looked normal, and relief immediately washed over her. The doctor said he didn't really know what was wrong, but if it was a virus, it should pass through her system soon enough. But in the meantime, he was going to prescribe her with a few medications to help manage the pain and discomfort. First, he was giving her prescription-strength ibuprofen, which was more potent than anything she could get over the counter. But because painkillers that strong can cause stomach irritation, he was also prescribing some medicine to protect her stomach lining and reduce the nausea. Sabrina thanked him and took some deep breaths to calm herself down. She told herself this would all be over in a few days and everything would be back to normal. However, the medicine didn't help, and a few days later, Sabrina was curled up on the couch in her living room, hugging her stomach. The pain hadn't let up all day. Earlier that morning, she'd felt good enough to go to school, but halfway through her first class, the familiar twisting pain erupted in her stomach, and she had to run immediately to the nurse's office. Her mom had left work to come take her home. Sabrina moaned and squeezed her eyes shut as her mother hurried into the living room with a glass of water and the extra-strength ibuprofen tablets. Sabrina reached for them and downed the pills, hoping the stabbing sensation would go away soon. But the throbbing kept spreading through her belly, and eventually she cried out for her mother again, who came rushing back into the living room to see what was the matter. Sabrina could barely choke out the words, but she told her mom it felt like the ibuprofen was actually making her stomach feel worse. Now she thought she was going to throw up again. Tears streamed down her face as she grabbed the trash can by the end table. Her mother told her to hang tight. She stood up and raced towards the kitchen and came back with the bottle of anti-nausea medication. She told Sabrina to take one. This would help calm her stomach after the ibuprofen. Her mom shook a pill out of the bottle and handed it to Sabrina. Sabrina hesitated. The last pill had only made things worse, and so she was weary of taking something else. But then Sabrina's stomach twisted horribly again, and so she just looked up at her mom, gave her a thin smile, took the pill, and popped it into her mouth. But once her mom had left the room, Sabrina spit the pill back out. She didn't know why, but she was sure the medication wasn't helping. She told herself that she could just, tough it out and fight through this thing, and soon everything would be better. 1 week later, Sabrina gritted her teeth as she slowly walked across the dark emergency room parking lot beside her mother. It was long after midnight. Every movement she made sent a new jolt of pain through her stomach. Her condition had not gotten better, and tonight, when she was still in bed, she had suddenly woken up with horrible pain in her stomach. The pain was very sharp and deep, like her whole stomach was seizing up. She'd asked her mom to take her back to the ER, and now every step across the parking lot felt like a stab in her side. By the time they reached the hospital doors, Sabrina was barely able to stand, much less walk. Quickly, a nurse put her in a wheelchair and took her back to a cubicle in the ER. Once they were there, Sabrina's mom helped her crawl onto the hospital bed. Then the nurse explained that the doctor would be in soon, but for now, they would do another ultrasound, and they would also test her for sexually transmitted diseases. Sabrina and her mother nodded. 30 minutes later, a different doctor than the one who treated her last time stepped into the cubicle. He told Sabrina that her STD test had come back negative. Then he asked if Sabrina's meds had made any difference in her pain levels over the past week. Sabrina shook her head and said no, explaining that the extra-strength ibuprofen hadn't helped. If anything, it actually had made her pain worse. And after that first time having that horrible adverse reaction to the ibuprofen, or so she thought, she had been too afraid to take any of the other medicines in fear that they too would cause more pain. So she had not been taking the anti-nausea pills or the meds for her stomach lining. Upon hearing this, the doctor looked sort of puzzled. He told Sabrina that it didn't seem like she was having an adverse reaction to the meds, and it really didn't seem like there was anything seriously wrong with her stomach. The only way to get past this was to go through it, and those pills were supposed to help her endure the discomfort. Sabrina smiled and said okay, but inside, she was fuming. It took everything she had not to scream and pull out her hair. As soon as she was discharged, she told her mother they needed to find another doctor, one who would actually help. One week later, pediatrician Dr. Kenny Huang introduced himself to his new patient, Sabrina. Sabrina's mom had brought her into his hospital in Boston after 2 trips to their local emergency room did not resolve Sabrina's stomach pain. Sabrina explained to him that her pain seemed to be getting worse and more frequent. Dr. Huang could see she was on the verge of tears as she spoke, and so he promised her he would help them get to the bottom of this. Dr. Huang asked Sabrina to lie back on the table. He was going to press around her abdomen to see what was triggering her pain. Sabrina sighed. She said she'd been through this already, and none of the doctors had said anything was wrong with her. Dr. Huang gave her a reassuring pat on her shoulder. He knew how frustrating this was for her, but he needed to check for himself. Maybe he'd find something that the others hadn't. Sabrina nodded and then followed Dr. Huang's instructions. After she laid down, he began gently pressing his fingertips into her abdomen, searching for a tender spot. Sabrina stayed quiet during the exam, but the doctor noticed her wincing every time he pressed into her stomach. It seemed like the whole area was sensitive. It did not seem like the pain was originating from one single spot. When he was done, he asked Sabrina to try to describe what she actually felt inside of her abdomen. Sabrina looked at him skeptically, like she didn't trust Dr. Huang was even going to believe her. Sensing this, Dr. Huang grabbed his clipboard and promised the teenager that he was listening and was even going to take notes. Sabrina explained how severe her pain was becoming. Each episode was an 8 out of 10 at this point in terms of pain. It would come on suddenly and was so intense she would vomit. Once she threw up, the twisting feeling usually subsided a little. In total, the spasms usually lasted about 15 minutes, but sometimes they were longer, and those longer episodes were absolute agony. Dr. Huang listened intently as Sabrina explained why she refused to take any more of her medication. He nodded, trying to show Sabrina that he was taking her concerns seriously. Then, when Sabrina stopped talking for a second, he asked her if she'd been experiencing any other changes since all of this started. Sabrina nodded. She said she wasn't very hungry anymore and felt tired and dizzy a lot of the time. She hesitated for a moment, looking sort of embarrassed, then confessed that she'd also been experiencing constipation and hadn't had a bowel movement for 3 days. It was making her stomach feel even more uncomfortable. At this point, Sabrina's mom chimed in and began telling Dr. Huang about all of Sabrina's medical history, from when she was a toddler to now. She talked about her daughter's history of anemia, and also when she was a toddler, she had a condition called pica, in which she would eat foods that were not really foods, but she'd grown out of it, and basically anything she could think of that maybe to some degree was playing a role in what was going on with her now, because no one seemed to know. But after her mother had sort of rattled off everything she could think of, Dr. Huang just sat there silently, having really no idea what was going on with Sabrina. And really nothing that her mother had just told him seemed to be playing a role here. And so the doctor thought, okay, well, maybe she's got some kind of food allergy. Except that her pain was getting steadily worse, which is not typical of allergies. And so Dr. Huang knew he needed to run more tests and take a deeper look into Sabrina's stomach. Dr. Huang told Sabrina and her mother that he was going to order a CT scan of Sabrina's abdomen, just to make sure there wasn't some kind of blockage in her gut. Later that afternoon, Dr. Huang sat at his desk, looking over Sabrina's lab work. He was truly stumped. Her CT scan had revealed healthy organs and just a small amount of what looked like stool backed up in her gut. It was all completely normal, and so it allowed him to rule out more serious conditions like gallbladder disease or pancreatitis. The doctor had been wondering if her lab results might reveal an infection, but they came back normal too. In the meantime, Dr. Huang felt confident that he could give Sabrina a few more medications that would help soothe her pain and relieve her constipation without upsetting her stomach further. The doctor took a cup of medications to Sabrina's room and handed them over to her. Sabrina took the cup and stared at the pills like they might be poison. Dr. Huang assured her that none of these meds would make her stomach pain any worse. It was just an antacid pill to help neutralize her stomach acid, an antihistamine to calm her nerves a bit, and a laxative to help with the constipation. He said they were also going to give her an injection of local anesthetic to try to help numb the pain a bit too. Sabrina nodded and gulped the pills down with water. Then Dr. Huang quickly gave her the numbing shot. The doctor threw the needle away and then turned to head back to his office when Sabrina started heaving. He spun back around in time to see the teenager lean forward in her bed, grab a vomit bag, and spew the water and pills she had just swallowed back up. Dr. Huang was shocked. He'd never seen a patient throw up pills that fast. Whatever was plaguing Sabrina had to be a rare condition. He helped Sabrina clean up, then threw away the vomit bag and pressed the call button for the nurse. While they waited, the doctor's mind began to race. To him, the key symptom was how swiftly her stomach pain appeared and disappeared, plus the fact that her abdomen seemed tender all the time. It made him wonder if the issue was in her digestive system, maybe even something called malrotation, a condition where the intestines don't rotate properly during fetal development. It could be causing her issues now that her body was maturing. But as soon as he thought of that, Dr. Huang realized that malrotation couldn't be the problem. It would have shown up in her CT scan. In fact, all the conditions and diseases he could think of would have been revealed by the CT scan or an ultrasound. And the only thing he could see in her digestive tract was the small collection of stool. Once the nurse arrived, Dr. Huang excused himself and headed back up to his office. Once he was there, he sat down at his desk and pulled up Sabrina's medical chart. And as he read it over, he remembered something Sabrina's mother had told him when she went over the entirety of her daughter's medical history. she had told him about a condition that her daughter used to have but did not have anymore. Dr. Huang had ruled that condition out when he had first heard it, but now he wondered if maybe she still had that condition. Dr. Huang had actually seen that condition before, and he knew it was a tough one to diagnose because oftentimes those suffering from it hid some of their symptoms out of pure embarrassment, which obviously makes diagnosis much more difficult. And so now Dr. Huang wondered if maybe Sabrina was actually still suffering from that condition and knew she was suffering from it, but was simply too embarrassed to say so. But Dr. Huang still felt like there could be something else going on with Sabrina, and so he decided what he would just do is order a simple procedure where a thin, flexible tube with a light and a camera attached to it would be inserted into Sabrina's mouth and would travel down into her stomach, and he could just see for himself what was going on. A few hours later, Dr. Huang watched on a monitor as that camera traveled down Sabrina's esophagus and into her stomach. And immediately, once it was in her stomach, he knew what was causing her pain. Sabrina was suffering from a trichobezoar, or a giant ball of human hair inside of her gut. Stomach acid doesn't readily dissolve hair, so it does not move through the digestive system easily. And so if too much of it gets swallowed, it usually gets lodged in the folds of the stomach's gastric lining. From there, it can trap food and gunk to form this tight, gooey, matted wad. And over time, that wad just gets bigger and bigger. In Sabrina's case, the wad had been showing up on all of her scans, but her doctors had just assumed it was stool. It was not until Dr. Huang remembered Sabrina had pica as a child, which is where the child will eat non-food items. And at that point, Dr. Huang began to suspect that maybe she had continued eating non-food items into her older age, and maybe she had this rare condition called Rapunzel syndrome, where she actually was compulsively ingesting her own hair, causing this trichobezoar to form. Like many people who suffer from Rapunzel syndrome, Sabrina felt ashamed about her condition, which is very likely why she didn't mention it to any of her doctors when she began having this intense stomach pain. In fairness to her, likely she'd been eating her hair for much of her life, since she was a kid, and so she didn't think, this could suddenly cause this huge wad in her stomach now. If it hadn't happened before, why would it happen now? However, Sabrina's condition turned out to be even worse than just a simple hairball. Hair from the tangled mass inside of her had dangled down from her stomach and into her small bowel. Not only did these dangling hairs cause her nausea and pain, they also put her at risk for a host of complications, including perforation of the stomach and intestines and acute pancreatitis. Dr. Huang diagnosed Sabrina in the nick of time. Surgeons were able to remove a hairball about 2.5 inches wide, along with the dangling hair, relieving Sabrina's intense pain and allowing her digestive tract to heal. The doctor also referred Sabrina to a psychiatrist to help with her condition, so that she didn't just develop more hairballs in the future. And now, here's our second story called Sleeping Beauty. On a dreary morning in West Seattle in 2003, 14-year-old Amanda Wu trudged downstairs into the kitchen where her mother, Carol, was making breakfast. Amanda sat down at the table next to her father, Peter, and quickly stifled a yawn. She had not gotten much sleep the night before. She'd woken up feeling achy, and her brain still felt fuzzy. She told her parents she thought she might have the flu. Carol turned around from the stove and gave her daughter a skeptical look. She reminded Amanda that she had tennis practice that afternoon, plus a history test she'd been studying for, so she could only stay home if she had a fever. When her dad didn't come to the rescue, Amanda sighed and stumbled down the hallway to get a thermometer. And as she walked, she felt really clumsy and totally exhausted. But she finally retrieved the thermometer and stuck it under her tongue. By the time she was back in the kitchen, the thermometer was beeping. It was done. And her mother took a look. No fever. She told Amanda, go get ready for school. Amanda's first period that day was English, a class she usually liked. She was a top student, and that day she was even ahead on her reading. But today, she just couldn't seem to focus. She kept losing her place, and the words on the page just looked scrambled. It was like a layer of fog had settled in her brain. She felt like she needed to splash her face with water to wake up. So she raised her hand and asked to go to the bathroom. But then, the next thing she knew, she was lying on a cot in the nurse's office with her worried parents standing over her. Amanda had no idea how she got there. She had no recollection of even leaving her classroom. But then she glanced over at the clock on the wall and saw that over an hour had passed since she had asked to go to the bathroom. She looked from her mom to her dad to the nurse, and then asked what happened. The nurse explained that a couple of her classmates found her passed out on the floor of the girls' bathroom. They tried to shake her awake, but she wouldn't budge. So they'd called for help, and a member of the staff got her to her feet and then walked her down to the nurse's office. The nurse said that Amanda had clearly been groggy, but she had been able to crawl onto the cot by herself. Amanda just blinked in shock. She had no memory of any of that, and this realization sent a chill through her. Had she really been moving around, going about her day while blacked out? But the nurse assured her that very likely she had simply fainted from dehydration, and so she just needed some rest and plenty of fluids. A year later, Amanda's father, Peter, hurried up the stairs to Amanda's room. He'd already called her down to breakfast twice. If she didn't hurry, she'd be late for school. But when he opened his daughter's door, he found Amanda still buried under her covers. She told him she felt too sick to get out of bed, and that her brain felt fuzzy. Over the past few months, his daughter had had a few days like this, where she felt sick and ended up sleeping most of the day, and she always felt better after getting some rest. Plus, Peter remembered last year's fainting episode at school, and so he really didn't want to push her. So he told her to drink some water and just go back to sleep. However, this time wound up being different. By the next morning, Peter was worried. Usually, when Amanda stayed in bed and had sort of a sleepy day because she was sick, she would still come downstairs for meals or to watch a little TV. But the day before, she was out cold until late afternoon, even though he'd tried to wake her up a couple of times. He'd heard her get up maybe once or twice to use the bathroom, but other than that, she'd stayed up there the whole day. Soon, Peter heard movement on the stairs, and a moment later, his daughter walked in. He was about to say good morning, but Amanda just beelined for the fridge, wrenching the door open, and then she began grabbing every bit of food she could find. She raided the cheese drawer, the deli meats, the leftovers. Peter joked with her to slow down, that he was almost done making breakfast, but Amanda totally ignored him. Then she took her pile of food to the living room and flopped onto the couch. But she didn't even turn on the TV. She just began ravenously shoving the food into her mouth. Peter had never seen his daughter act like this. He called for her to come into the kitchen and eat at the table so she didn't make a mess all over the couch. Amanda stopped eating, and slowly she turned and looked back at her father, and in this weird, soft, childlike voice he had never heard before, she told him to leave her alone. And that's when Peter got a really good look at his daughter's face for the first time. Her expression was vacant, and her eyes were seemingly unfocused, like she was in a trance. And then, in that same high-pitched voice, she yelled at her father to go away, and then without warning, she let out this high-pitched scream and dove onto the couch, banging her fists and kicking hysterically, like a toddler throwing a tantrum. Amanda was acting possessed, like something out of a horror movie, and Peter didn't know what to do. But he knew something was seriously wrong, and he needed to get his daughter to the hospital. He called Carol, who had already left for work, and told her they were going to the emergency room. An hour later, Peter was at a loss as he told an ER doctor what had happened that morning. He knew his story made Amanda sound unstable, but he assured the doctor that typically she was a healthy, active, overall very normal kid. She played tennis and basketball, she had friends at school. Her behavior that morning was completely out of character. They were in a cubicle at the ER, where Amanda was sleeping on a hospital bed. She had calmed down in the car on the way over, and then quickly fallen asleep. In fact, she was so out of it that Peter could barely wake her up enough to make it inside the hospital. And now, looking over at his daughter, who was sleeping soundly in the middle of a loud, chaotic emergency room, it was like she was physically incapable of waking up. The ER doctor asked Peter if there had been any other changes to her sleeping patterns over the past few months. Peter admitted that lately, when Amanda felt sick, she could sleep for most of the day. But she was also a teenager now, and teenagers always sleep a lot, so he hadn't thought much of it. The doctor took some notes and then said he wanted to put Amanda on antidepressants. It sounded like she was struggling, maybe with the transition from junior high to high school, and medication could help. Peter thanked the doctor and then had to shake Amanda awake and told her it was time to go. She groaned and slowly sat upright. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes were still unfocused. She was so drowsy she could barely hold her head up. Peter bent down and helped his daughter to her feet. He wasn't sure how he was going to tell her that she might be starting antidepressants, especially since Amanda was not usually withdrawn or down. In fact, she was actually a really upbeat kid with an active social life and ambitious college plans. And so deep down, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that something else might be going on here, aside from teenage anxiety. But he also wanted Amanda to feel like her old self and have the energy to tackle new adventures. So perhaps the antidepressants were worth a try. Several years later, on a crisp fall day in 2007, Amanda, who was now 18 years old, paddled a canoe across a clear blue lake in northern Minnesota, taking in the stunning scenery all around her. She'd spent the last month on an outdoor survival program called Outward Bound. They'd been in the wilderness for weeks, and so far she'd been having a blast. The program was difficult, but also fun. For the first time in years, Amanda felt like herself again, and now she was beginning the hardest part of the expedition, a final challenge before the program came to an end. She was supposed to spend the next 3 nights camping alone in the wilderness, proving to herself that she was capable of being on her own. By doing this, she felt like she was officially overcoming her health issues. The antidepressants she had been prescribed hadn't really helped. In fact, ever since that hospital visit back in 2004, her sleeping episodes had gotten worse. She would wake up some mornings feeling foggy and sluggish, and then she would realize that days or even weeks had passed by and she basically had no recollection of them. Her parents would tell her that over that period of time, she'd been sleeping for 16 or 18 hours each day. And then when she was awake, she would regress into this weird childlike state. Sometimes when she was like this, she would throw those tantrums. Other times, she would make her parents these little arts and crafts projects, like the ones she did in preschool. But for sure, the weirdest of all of this was the fact that these episodes, which again could go for weeks or months, left her with basically no memory of them. Amanda and her parents had no idea what triggered these episodes or what made them stop. But it was completely disorienting for Amanda. I mean, huge chunks of her life seemed to just be vanishing. I mean, just the previous year, Amanda had come home from a basketball practice, excited for a game the next afternoon. She'd gone to sleep that day, and when she woke up, she found out that 4 months had passed, and she had quit the team. It felt like she was living as 2 different people, a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the doctors also didn't know how to help. They suggested that she very likely had extreme depression combined with some other condition like schizophrenia, but Amanda didn't know what to think. She was depressed, but only because she was missing out on so much of life during these weird spells. It just felt like it was impossible to cope. But when she learned about the Outward Bound program, something about it really spoke to her. Now, to this point, nothing she was doing was really having any positive effect on these sleeping spells. They were still happening, and she still had no control over it. No one knew why they were happening or how to stop them. But for some reason, she just felt like maybe by doing this program and spending a bunch of time outdoors and sort of learning survival skills and sort of being around other people in a natural environment, that would maybe help rebuild her self-confidence. That could be the key to learning how to control this behavioral disorder. And she also felt like by doing this program, she could, show the world that she was still the same ambitious person she had always been. And so far, the program had been working. She'd made it through 30 nights of wilderness living with some instructors and other campers nearby, but for the most part on her own. And so far, she had had no sleeping episodes. She was feeling better and better about herself and wondered if maybe it was this simple. Doing a program like this, being out in nature, was the path back to some kind of normalcy. Amanda's canoe reached the edge of the lake and she disembarked. She wanted to make camp while the sun was still overhead. Amanda dragged her canoe onto the shore, then began setting up her tent. Once it was set up, she unrolled her sleeping bag inside and then set her canister of dried food outside. It was going to be just enough to last for 3 days. Then she closed the front door flap and settled in for the night. When Amanda opened her eyes, she was still inside of her tent, and even though she couldn't see outside, she could tell it was bright out. Just then, she heard the tent flap rustle, and she thought there was maybe an animal out there, and she sat upright in a panic, but then when the tent flap opened, she saw it was just her instructor. He asked her if she was okay. Amanda nodded and said yeah, she had just woken up, she was fine. Then she stretched and leaned back on her sleeping bag, and she heard something crinkle. She looked down and saw some food wrappers scattered over her sleeping bag. She also saw her food canister was in the tent, and it was empty. All of her food was gone, even though she had no memory of eating it. She suddenly had a sinking feeling in her gut. She looked up at her instructor and asked what day it was. The instructor looked concerned. He told her it was the last morning of her trip, and she was way behind schedule. She should be packed up and halfway back to their main camp by now. He'd come to check on her multiple times over the past few days, but she'd always been asleep or so groggy she could barely hold a conversation. He saw that her food was gone by the end of day 1, and he'd been worried about her having enough to eat. Amanda suddenly felt totally relieved to just be alive. I mean, clearly she had just had an episode while she was out in the wild by herself. This wilderness survival idea had been a mistake. She wasn't ready. And if she was ever going to be ready, if she was ever going to get this condition under control and live with any level of independence, she needed to find some real answers about what was going on with her. A few months later, in 2008, a neuroradiologist named Dr. Barney Hughes came out to the waiting room at a medical center in Seattle, Washington. A neuroradiologist is a doctor who uses imagery like X-rays, MRIs, and CT scans to diagnose and treat conditions of the head, brain, spine, and neck. Dr. Hughes walked over to Peter, Carol, and their daughter Amanda, who looked up at him with very groggy eyes. Her hair hung in greasy strands in front of her face. There was a small film crew with the family as well. Amanda's story had caught the attention of a documentary crew working on a film about rare illnesses, and they had been documenting her difficult life for the past 6 months. During that time, Dr. Hughes had been observing Amanda. Last week, he'd taken an MRI while she was awake and alert. Then, he had asked Peter and Carol to bring Amanda in the next time she was having a sleeping episode, so they could do another MRI and compare the scans. This morning, her parents had called to say she was in one of her sleeping states, and so they had brought her over to the hospital. Dr. Hughes said hello to Peter and Carol, and then sat down beside Amanda. Secretly, he suspected what her illness might be, but he wanted to see her brain scans first to confirm the diagnosis. He asked Amanda if she was ready for her MRI, and she nodded, but absent-mindedly. Once Amanda was inside the MRI machine, Dr. Hughes asked her to squeeze her left hand into a fist. He wanted to capture her brain activity while she was performing simple tasks. Next, after he had gotten her to do that, he asked Amanda to think of certain words to increase activity in a different part of her brain. This increased activity would light up on the images created by the scanner. And then later that afternoon, Dr. Hughes compared this new MRI image to the one he had taken last week, and what he saw confirmed his diagnosis. Amanda had Klein-Levin syndrome, more commonly known as sleeping beauty disorder. Klein-Levin syndrome, or KLS, is a rare brain disorder linked to problems in the areas of the brain that regulate sleep and behavior, such as the thalamus and hypothalamus. Research suggests that during a KLS episode, these regions don't receive enough blood flow, which may cause excessive sleep and personality changes. Some scientists also believe that a chemical imbalance in the brain plays a role. In Amanda's case, the brain scans confirmed that blood flow to her thalamus dropped by 15% when she was experiencing one of her episodes. And so KLS could explain why she slept up to 20 hours a day during those episodes, and also would experience mood swings and regressions. KLS typically begins in adolescence, with episodes occurring multiple times a year, and Amanda's symptoms fit that pattern. Unfortunately, though, there is no cure for KLS, but the condition usually improves over time, and the episodes become milder and less frequent. In Amanda's case, she would continue having severe episodes until she was 21. Her longest KLS episode was when she woke up one morning and couldn't recall the last 8 months. However, as she grew older, her episodes decreased in severity, and she was better able to manage her condition with the help of medications. At 7 p.m. on October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentik flew his small plane over a body of water just south of Australia called the Bass Strait. He'd just taken off from Melbourne, Australia, and his flight plan was to go 60 miles south to an island called King Island. And he was really excited about this flight. Not so much about where he was going, but because this represented the first time he'd actually be flying by himself at night. So Frederick had always dreamed of becoming a pilot, but the journey to actually becoming one had been really difficult. He had applied twice actually to the Royal Australian Air Force, but unfortunately he could not meet their requirements. And then also he had tried to become a commercial airline pilot, but he had failed their tests. But luckily for Frederick, his father had a ton of money, and he ultimately swooped in and funded Frederick to take some private lessons, and through that he was able to ultimately pass the tests and get his pilot's license. And so as Frederick coasted along, looking down below at the lights of Melbourne disappearing behind him, he felt like he was on top of the world. He was doing the one thing he had always dreamed of, and he was so happy, and it was so cool to be doing it at night by himself. And so he was just looking out at the sights and looking ahead at the Bass Strait, which is this huge, dark expanse of water. And it was like everything was right in the world. He was doing exactly what he wanted to do. However, only a few minutes into this flight, at 7:06 p.m., something strange happened. As Frederick was flying along, he suddenly became aware of a light coming from somewhere behind him. Remember, it's nighttime, so it's totally dark where he is, and he's flying over a body of water, so he's kind of like in this void of darkness. And so any lights are really gonna illuminate the cockpit. And so he sees this light, he turns around, and maybe 3,000 or 4,000 feet behind him, he sees what looks like a plane. That is the source of the light. And right away, Frederick's thinking that is both surprising and also potentially very problematic, because he knew from his training that that was far too close to be to another plane. And so the only explanation was either that pilot was off course or Frederick was off course. And Frederick's thinking, if I'm off course here and I'm flying where I shouldn't be, I'm gonna get in trouble with air traffic control and I might lose my pilot's license. Like the one thing I covet, I might lose it. And so initially, Frederick really didn't know what to do. He was sort of panicking and just kind of frozen, like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do right now. And as this was happening, Frederick kept instinctively looking back at this light, trying to figure out what this plane was doing. And every time he would turn around over the course of just a few seconds, it was very obvious that this light, this other plane, was gaining on him. And so Frederick starts to worry, like, this is not just about maybe getting in trouble or not. This plane might crash into me. Look how fast they're going. Like, what do I do? And so Frederick, at this point, he double checked that he was on course, and based on his instruments and what he had been doing, he really felt like he was on course here. And he just thinks, you know what, the best thing I can do here is just call air traffic control. So he grabs the radio and he gets a hold of Melbourne Air Traffic Control and he says, hey, there's this plane that is like right behind me. They're gaining on me. I'm worried they're gonna crash into me. Do I need to deviate? Like, what's going on here? And the air traffic controller very calmly says, okay, let me check the radar. Let me check the schedules. And so Frederick, the whole time he's waiting for a response, he's looking over his shoulder and still this light is gaining on him. It's getting closer and closer. And then finally the controller gets back on the radio and they tell Frederick, there is no other aircraft anywhere near you. Like, there's nothing over the Bass Strait. You are completely alone. But Frederick couldn't believe this because by now, the light, the aircraft that was right behind him has gotten right behind his. It's basically right on his tail. And Frederick is now completely panicked and he's getting ready to try to explain, like, no, wait a minute, like there's gotta be a better explanation here. There's something right here. But at that very moment, it becomes very clear to Frederick that this is not some ordinary aircraft, because it began doing something when it got right up behind his aircraft that no normal aircraft could do. This light suddenly began orbiting Frederick's aircraft. Frederick is traveling forward, and this ball of light is basically whipping around his aircraft as fast as can be. He can barely make it out. He's starting to panic, and at the same time, Frederick begins to hear the sound of his engine starting to fail. And there was no reason for it. His craft was fine when he took off, but now it's clearly sputtering and failing. And so all Frederick could do in this totally intense, panicked moment is just grab the radio and begin talking to air traffic control about what he was seeing. The person Frederick actually spoke to on the ground in this moment was an air traffic controller in Melbourne named Steve Roby. And Frederick would come off to Steve like he was totally crazy and unhinged, and Steve would say that he couldn't really understand what he was talking about. But at some point, Frederick clearly began talking about some sort of craft orbiting his own, and that his engine was starting to fail, and he didn't know what was going to happen, and he couldn't make an emergency landing. He was over water. And then suddenly Steve remembers hearing this grinding metallic sound come over the radio that basically washed out whatever Frederick was saying. And then it just goes deadly silent. And after that, Frederick disappeared. They searched the area where they knew he was before he disappeared, but they never found his plane. There was no sign of a crash. He never landed at King Island or went back to Melbourne. He was just gone. All they have is that final recording of him describing something orbiting him, then this grinding metallic sound, and then silence. And recently, that audio recording was made public. Now, before I actually play a clip from that audio, here's the official explanation for what happened to Frederick. As he was flying over the Bass Strait, it was so dark and there were no lights really anywhere that at some point, because he's an inexperienced pilot, I suppose, he flipped his plane upside down without realizing it, and the light that he was seeing was actually just a reflection off the water below of his own plane. And eventually, from flying upside down, his engine began to fail, and he crashed into the Bass Strait. However, not everybody believes this explanation, because one, it seems sort of preposterous to imagine that Frederick would not have realized he had flipped the plane upside down and was flying for so long inverted. Like, how could you not notice that? And two, this would not be the first time that somebody reported unexplained phenomena over the Bass Strait. In fact, over the years leading up to this incident with Frederick, there had been so many reports of UFOs flying over the Bass Strait and also unexplained disappearances that they've dubbed the Bass Strait the Bass Strait Triangle, after the Bermuda Triangle. Basically, it's a part of the world where a disproportionate number of unexplained phenomena occur. And so to this day, Frederick's disappearance remains a mystery. All we have is his final call for help.
Delta Sierra Juliet, what type of aircraft is it? That was deleted from the press accounts for some reason. Delta Sierra Juliet, and confirm you cannot identify the aircraft. Delta Sierra Juliet, roger. Stand by. Can you describe the aircraft? Delta Sierra Juliet, roger. How large would the object be? Delta Sierra Juliet. Delta Sierra Juliet, confirm that your aircraft just vanished. Delta Sierra Juliet, is the aircraft still with you? Delta Sierra Juliet, roger. What are your intentions?
My intention is to go to King Island, Melbourne, the aircraft is bothering a properly again. And it's bothering, and it's not an aircraft. Delta Sierra Juliet, Melbourne.
Before we get into the story, I want you guys to be looking at this through the lens of trying to decipher whether or not you believe this really happened, because there is a large percentage of people that say this is just an urban legend. However, there is a couple details that make it really hard to just write off. Number one, you have a number of international ships and listening stations that all reported hearing this same distress signal, and it's a very unique distress signal that we'll get into. In addition, you have the U.S. Coast Guard in one of their, fairly credible publications published a story about this case 5 years after it happened. And then you have the fact that this case has been around since 1947. It's been 70 plus years and no one's officially debunked it. So let's dive in. In 1947, several Dutch, American, and English ships, along with a number of listening stations, picked up the strange distress signal that was coming from somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The distress signal, which was in Morse code, went like this.
An officer, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead.
Then there was a burst of indecipherable Morse code, and then it ended with 2 words.
I die.
Then silence. One ship that heard this distress signal was the Silver Star. It was an American vessel that was kind of patrolling the waterways around the coast of Malaysia. And with the help of other ships in and around the Indian Ocean and some of the listening stations, they were able to triangulate the location of this distress signal. And they pinpointed a ship called the SS Orang Medan that was located right at the end of the Strait of Malacca, which is the primary shipping lane between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so this ship was basically drifting out towards the Indian Ocean. And so the first thing that the Silver Star does is they try to send a message back to the Orang Medan. But after numerous failed attempts, the captain of the Silver Star decides that we need to go investigate because something is obviously not right here. So the Silver Star tells all the other ships in the area, along with the other listening stations, that they are going to be the search party. They're going to reroute and head for the Orang Medan, because at this point, anybody that had heard that signal is saying, like, what do we do? Like, are we going to go investigate? Are you? After a couple of hours of heading straight for the Orang Medan, they see off in the distance the ship. From the eyes of these very experienced sailors on the Silver Star, they knew almost immediately that this ship is dead in the water. It's just drifting, which is not a good sign, especially if you combine that with the signal they got. As they get closer and closer to this ship, it becomes creepier and creepier because they're looking up, and in the bridge where the steering wheel would be, they can't make any person out. There's no one up there. There's nobody standing on the edge. I mean, they just sent this distress signal. You would think with a ship that's dead in the water that they would be lining the outside of the ship trying to signal someone down. But no, it's just quiet. No one on board, all lights off, just drifting, bobbing in the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean. And so as they get closer, they start blowing their whistle to try to attract anybody on the Orang Medan to signal them back. They're also doing more Morse code to try to get their attention again, not being picked up. And so finally, after all these failed attempts and just the general weirdness around it, the captain of the Silver Star decides, we need to board this ship. So the Silver Star crew members, they knew before they boarded that almost definitely they were going to find something terribly wrong with this ship. There's just too many red flags about it. They were anticipating something bad. but I don't think that they were really prepared for just how bad this was going to be. So they board the ship, and right away on deck is a number of crew members that had passed away. They're all deceased. And the mystery really kicks in the position, the body position of all of the dead crew members. They were all on their back with their hands outstretched in front of them, as if defending themselves from some unseen assailant above them. Even strangers, they had this look of abject terror on their face, as if the final moments before they died were just excruciatingly painful and terrifying. Even the dog was in a position with its teeth bared. It looked like it was growling up into the sky. All of them. And so obviously the Silver Star crew members are, shocked at what they find. And they're kind of looking at each of these dead crew members and they're like, what is going on? So they make their way up to the bridge, and everybody's also dead in the same position, basically fighting with some unseen assailant in their final moments before they pass. The person who had been sending out the distress signal had literally slouched over the telegraph. Like their finger was literally on the telegraph. He's the only one that was not doing this. He was on the telegraph and had passed away in that position. So they go down into the bowels of the ship. Normally, inside of a steel ship in the boiler room, it's going to be pretty hot. There's no real ventilation to speak of. Not to mention outside, it was over 100 degrees. They went down into the boiler room and down into the ship, and it was strikingly cold. Some of the crew members from the Silver Star said it felt like it might have been about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They found more crew members also passed away, also fighting with something in the air, with that look of abject terror on their face. So all of the crew has perished in this very bizarre way. There was no overt damage to the ship. It just appeared that the engine had been turned off, but ultimately the ship had no real damage to it at all. They couldn't find anything. The crew, despite meeting a fairly unfortunate end, also had no signs of outside injury, external injury. Something had obviously caused them all to perish, but there was no injuries outside their body. In addition, all of them showed signs of rapidly decomposing. Considering they had just been tapping away that distress signal hours earlier, unless the person communicating the distress signal had been the last one alive for a long time, it doesn't really add up that they had decomposed as quickly as they had relative to when this distress signal was sent. So the captain of the Silver Star, taking into account all of the strangeness, decides not to touch any of the bodies, leave them where they are, get off the ship, tie a tow line to the Orang Medan, and tow it in. We're going to have experts look at this and figure out what happened. And so they attach the tow line, the crew members of the Silver Star, and as soon as they begin to move it, they notice, the crew of the Silver Star, that smoke has begun billowing out of the inside of the Orang Medan. And so, not taking any chances, they cut the tow line and they literally jump back onto the Silver Star right as the Orang Medan explodes. In fact, there was a quote which basically said it exploded with so much force that it was lifted out of the water entirely and then splashed back down and rapidly sank. So now you have no evidence. You have the testimony of the people that were on the ship, but other than that, you have no evidence. The ship is now gone. The captain of the Silver Star and his crew just have to go back to the mainland to try to make sense of what they just saw, because you have all these people that were involved and want to know what happened, and they're like, well, let me tell you, we saw this horrible thing on board and then it exploded and it disappeared. And so that's where the mystery kind of ends. But here we go. Let's get into what the primary critique is, because that's important here too. And then we'll hear the rebuttal, which I think is also pretty important. So people that believe this story is just a legend will point to the fact that there really isn't a good record of the SS Orang Medan ever existing. There's this one very important publication called Lloyd's Shipping Registers, where you would expect the Orang Medan to be registered, but they're not. Others will say that, well, Orang Medan translates to man of Medan, and Medan is near Sumatra, and that's where they were registered. So they weren't in Lloyd's shipping registers, they were in another registry. But either way, there is contention around whether or not this ship ever existed. But for those who say that this could be true, they say that, well, there's a good reason why those records don't exist, because someone's trying to cover it up. According to a German researcher who had spent decades covering the Orang Medan case, he published in the Death Ship on the South Seas, it's a publication from 1953, that the Orang Medan was transporting illegal materials, things like nitroglycerin and potassium cyanide. These are things used to create weapons. And there might have been a leak that led to the death of everyone on board. No physical injuries, but they passed away. And then also, after they tied that tow line, the materials could have detonated. Perhaps they detonated, that kind of thing. And so that still leads some questions, right? I mean, then how did the Silver Star crew not also get exposed to these chemicals as soon as they got there? Either way, it's a fascinating story, and I hope that you took something from it. So if you haven't already, I would really appreciate it if you liked this video and you hit subscribe on my channel. I will be posting at least 2 times a week going forward.
Drops dancing on the window. City lights begin to glow. Every road keeps moving forward to places we don't know. You wake up on the other side of a sunrise I can't see. Different streets and different stories, different versions we could be. Everybody has a playlist for the moments in their day. Some are running till tomorrow, some are finding their own way. Maybe we're like distant stars, shining through a different view, living under separate skylines, still connected like we always do. We're under different skies, chasing dreams in different.
Content just like this, so I hope you'll join, and that's